Hello and welcome back to Medical Compliance with Clarissa. I'm Clarissa Benfield, our Global Director and Business Line Leader of our Medical and Laboratory business here at Intertek. And today I am so thrilled to be joined by Jenny Larsson Falk. Jenny, how are you today?
Hi, Clarissa. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm very, very good today. And I'm also excited to be on this podcast with you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, maybe we'll start with just a quick introduction to yourself. Jenny, of course, you sit in our team in Sweden. So maybe you can talk a little bit about your history with Intertek and how you came to be in the medical business.
Yeah, I started at Intertek 12 years ago, almost now. And I almost immediately started testing for the medical devices in our team in Sweden. And our team in Sweden was started, the medical team was started out like back in the middle of the 80s. So we have a kind of a legacy, but so we test a lot of different products here. And then I went on to work with sales department as a technical questions solution engineer. And then I got back to operations and the safety testing as the technical leader in Stockholm.
Yes, so you are one of our all over subject matter experts. We're so thrilled to have you here to chat with us today. I think, of course, one of the interesting things for your perspective, right? You've been on the medical team for a long time, 10 plus years, working with all sorts of different types of medical devices and different types of manufacturers. So, across these years, you've kind of seen it all. You've seen the transition with the standards, you've seen the introduction of risk management, and really worked with a huge subset of clients. So excited to talk today about some of the most common questions that we see, things that have come up over the years, or things that maybe cause the most confusion with manufacturers. So excited that we'll be able to dig into those and hopefully provide some clarity. So I'm going to start off with an easy-ish one because this question comes up, I think, all the time in medical devices, laboratory devices, and even in other devices that we operate and work with. But let's talk about critical components. What do we mean when we call something a critical component? How do we identify a critical component? And then how is that information used once we have that from a manufacturer?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And one is of the most common I get all the time from clients, especially the new startup clients. For them, a critical component might be confused about, okay, what is critical for us? What is critical for functionality? But when we are talking about type testing and critical components, then we're talking about those components that helps the product to maintain basic safety, which essentially is protecting against electrical shock, mechanical hazards, irradiation hazards, and fire hazards, along with the essential performance of a medical equipment. So the clinical function, what maintains that one, or what sensor causes an alarm go off, so there is no unacceptable risk for a patient, for example. Those are the components that are critical for a test house and for a type testing. And those are those components that our clients really, really need to keep track of because you cannot switch them within a production line without making, what can you say, like a due diligence. What happens if we switch them out? Do we need to do retesting, for example? Are they equivalent in some other way? What happens if one goes obsolete? Those are those kind of questions you need to keep track of. So the critical component list is a very critical list for a product to be able to go through the whole product life cycle.
Yeah, and then we use that critical component list in our reports, right? So you'll see it references the manufacturer within your reports. I want to touch on a little bit too when you talk about making changes with critical components. So when we are starting an evaluation and doing our construction evaluation, we ask for information on the critical components. So what kind of information are we looking for from the manufacturer? How do we use that? And then what does that mean when you want to make a change then with one of your critical components?
Well, there are different ways to fulfill the standard requirements for a critical component. The easiest way is to have it separately certified according to their component standard. If the component standard is normative, which we will find in a special section of the standard, and you have a reference list there where you can compare, okay, so for example, fuses, if they protect against fire and electrical shock, both of them, then you have a special standard standing there. And that's one that you need to comply to. Then it might not always be enough because you have the component standard, but the 6601 standard series might add requirements on a specific component, but then the standard will also require it. So it might be at the bottom, at the baseline, you have a certification, and then you need to add up with some more verification testing, for example. So those are the information that we need. We need to know the rating of it because it has to fit it within the application it is implemented, of course. What else do we ask for? Yes, if we have any alternatives, for example, which is a good, I would say, a good design to actually look into it. Okay, we might need like 2 added alternative to those fuses just because they go obsolete. We know the components has been kind of hard to get right now, for example, during these past years with the pandemic.
We've talked about, we chatted about that a little bit on one of our other podcasts that we had, right? The supply chain issue, right? So making your reports as broad as possible, having these alternate components, alternate versions to make it easier on yourself as a manufacturer to swap things out, understanding that not every critical component change is going to require testing, but of course there's some where you can generally assume that it's always going to require testing, like you want to change your power supply, right? Most instances that is going to require testing. So getting that information up front, understanding what is critical to the electrical safety and function of the product, I think is so important, and definitely something that comes up quite often with manufacturers is, one of those questions as it happens right away when we're getting into the construction evaluation and looking at a product.
Yeah, of course. And if you as a manufacturer really have a knowledge about it, it's so much easier for you because it can take time to gather this information that is needed. At the end, I've had so many times where we have asked for a certificate, a specific one, before we can close out the project. It goes like 3-4 extra weeks just because they cannot get this information from the component supplier. So if they know about these ahead of time, you can actually shorten the time with us a little bit more.
Much more effective. Yeah, you mentioned too, and another thing that comes up a lot, I think, is this idea of fire protection and what that means and how you kind of understand overall what the fire protection requirements are and how that, comes from the standard, how you incorporate that with your product. So maybe you can touch on that a little bit. Yeah.
Fire protection is one issue that we talk a lot of, either that the manufacturers ask us about it. Okay, what do you think about our construction, or we need to actually coax them to you need to explain to us how to do this. But many manufacturers seem to miss a little bit is that you have the possibility of adding different approaches in different parts of your equipment. On the main side, it might be the best approach to have a fire enclosure. You enclose the fire because you have a lot of energy there. You don't have that many critical components, perhaps. It depends on the construction, of course, but it's easier to find flammability certificates on those plastic parts that are supposed to be maintained or implemented on the main side, versus the secondary side where you have very low voltages, for example, or very low energy. Then you might need to look in, it might be a better way to look into, okay, can we actually limit the energy to those parts so much that you actually cannot start a fire over here? You cannot maintain so much energy that it gets hot at all. Also, there are components that might be very hard to acquire that kind of information. If you go for a fire enclosure on your whole equipment, which has happened, then you have a lot of critical components. The list would be very long. So try to cut that off by Doing some single fault conditions, for example, a stepper motor. If you lock that one and nothing happens, it's perfectly fine because it's enclosed in metal, but we can see the implementation and how it works. Well, it just works out when it comes to fire hazard. Then you have that single fault condition that's already done, and then you don't have to have more requirements on that particular component, for example. So a combination of fire protection techniques is to be recommended in most medical equipment, I would say, that are bigger than just a handheld battery-driven one.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and I think, of course, too, one of the things we'll ask for is the flame rating on the material, right? We'll want to see that certificate if they are using a flame rated plastic of some kind. But then if they can't find that for their material, that's also something obviously that then we as a test house could test to, right? If you find a material that you're using or you're making a custom mold of a material and you want to test it and have it tested for a flame rating, that's a test that we can do.
Of course, we can always test, but it might take longer time. And if you don't have a strategy when you go into the design phase, when it comes to the fire protection, then you might end up making it more complicated than it actually needed as a manufacturer. So it's just for them to be aware of what happens. And those are in general, very good discussions. And a lot of people go, oh, I see, we did not know that we could do it. With the combination of techniques, for example. So I just want to highlight that one.
Well, and I think too, talking about flame rating and fires and things that can happen when we're doing testing, right? Because we're testing for all of these things. That's another question that comes up a lot. And I think it's important to touch on at this time, right? Is sample requirements and why we ask for multiple samples or how many samples we might ask for. So maybe you can just touch on briefly, what do we use the samples for if we're asking for 1, 2, 3 samples? Not just a single sample of a device.
Well, if you look into the standard, I think the idea from the beginning was we're doing a type test, which essentially is a test of one single sample, because it should be able to maintain safety throughout the whole requirements that applies for the product within the standard. However, sometimes or most of the time something breaks down during the testing. We tend to move those parts to the end of the testing, but you never know. So it's always good to have a spare. But also, if you're going to a test house in Stockholm, we do a lot of safety and EMC testing, maybe some ingress protection as well, if you have that one. Then you probably need a fresh sample for the ingress protection, because that one, it specifically says in the test method that we do need, it should be a fresh sample. It shouldn't have been opened and closed a lot, because we want to see what actually happens. And it's close to or even from production line. A lot of the equipment I see are prototypes in late stage where we try to do the type testing for. But sometimes that's not really possible, so we have to postpone the ingress protection testing, for example. So we really get the specific enclosure and the specific materials you use just to seal, like silicone or you have rubber in the when you try to put together the enclosure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think sometimes it might be a misconception, right? That it's like, they're asking for multiple samples to have extras, but that's really not the case. Oftentimes you may need a sample for EMC, a sample to do the IP testing, right? Because you want a fresh sample that's representative of the production line, a sample that we're opening for construction and doing testing on. So it really is to the benefit to have, multiple samples available, so you can not only maximize your testing timeline, but also make sure that you're hitting all of these requirements with samples as they need to be.
Yeah, and EMC testing, they might need another setup, for example, in software to run in certain cycles, while in safety, we are talking about normal condition in another way. So where we get so close to normal use as possible, practical possible, I would say. While EMC, they have those specific testings during specific times that they need to see things.
Looking at different modes of operations and things like that, to make sure it can pass. So really, really interesting. Okay, the other thing that comes up a lot, which I mean, we talk about this with everybody, is the idea of applied parts versus accessible parts being treated as applied parts. So how, as a manufacturer, do you start to navigate what do I exactly consider an applied part versus what's an accessible part? How do those relate together? And then how do we look at that from the testing side?
Yeah, that's also a tricky question, depending on, most of the manufacturers have no problem at all to identify an applied part, because that is very, very clear when it comes to the standard. And it's also connected to the clinical function, and they are very good at their own functionality of the product, of course. But then when it comes to those accessible parts that you need to assess through risk management, will they need to be treated as applied part when it comes to accessible temperature during normal use and single fault condition, for example? Or how about leakage currents? Is it possible for them to have too high leakage currents and the patient actually touches those? And that's a discussion what happens perhaps more when you have body-worn parts or handheld parts. Who is supposed to handheld these parts? Are those in the vicinity of the patient? Is it the patient itself that needs to carry them around because we are talking about rehabilitation, or you are hospitalized, but you are kind of movable around, but you need to be monitored in some ways. You need to carry it with you so you can go out and eat, and you can take a shower and so on, to just have as a good life as possible within a difficult situation without being harmed by the medical equipment. So those kind of products, we really need to assess, what kind of requirements would be necessary to have on those. So usually there is a discussion about those accessible parts because they are accessible per se, but will they need to be treated as if they were applied parts, but they are not applied parts because they don't do anything clinically, which is what the standard is asking for when it comes to an applied part. Yeah.
Well, and I think you touched on it briefly there too, but something we really should highlight, right? This is where it comes down to that importance of risk management and doing the risk management evaluation first, because this is a perfect example of how the risk management evaluation can then influence how testing is done. Because I think sometimes, people think, okay, well, let's just do our testing and then we can look at risk management. But here's a perfect example of, okay, if you have these accessible parts, as you're saying, if a patient is able to get up and walk around and access this in some way because they're, living, and it's especially now with how we're seeing technology just advance so much and so much more integrative medicine and people being able to use devices throughout their day-to-day life, right? Risk management, you have to do this evaluation first to understand, okay, do we need to treat these as applied parts because of the, normal use case and what you identified during your risk management evaluation? And then that can dictate how we perform the testing itself.
Yeah, definitely. So it's so important for the manufacturers to help us out here. They need to explain to us the functionality of their equipment. How is it used? What kind of environments? What happens around the patient?
Yeah, and I think that's been just an evolution over time, right? When we look at how we think about medical devices, how we think about healthcare, right? We've seen just this big evolution in how devices are being used. And it's amazing and fascinating the way that technology has advanced, but that just makes this risk step even more critical and really does make each testing, subset for manufacturers very bespoke, because everyone has now different risks that come from how their products are used and where they're able to be used and the advancements in technology. So I think that's such an interesting point. And when we always, we answer that question a lot as to, okay, why do you want to do a risk management file evaluation first versus the testing? And that's really, a clear indicator of why. Yeah. So the last question I want to have here, and then we'll wrap up, is surrounding essential performance. So this question comes up a lot. do I have essential performance? How do I identify my essential performance? Do I always have essential performance? And then how do we trace that back and within your RMF, right? What is that level of traceability to show, through the process of the risk management evaluation, identifying your essential performance, and then how that flows into the evaluation?
Yeah, definitely. So essential performance, this is the question, and I know you talked to other guests about this. So the essential performance is always connected to the clinical function of the product. Is it an unacceptable risk if something fails to notify the operator or the patient that something's happened? And this is something I think it have been a misunderstanding. You verify it once, but you actually need to keep track of it through the whole type testing, through EMC testing. After an IP test, you need to re-verify again. Okay, is it still maintained? Does those components that we previously identified as critical, do they work as supposed to?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So it's all connected back to the risk management file. And so the essential performance is, if we have it, we really need the manufacturer's help how to evaluate it. Is it more than one thing or more than one functionality that we need to verify works? Or is it more like an extensive set? How do we do it in the best efficient way? We might not be able to figure that out with a very close collaboration with the manufacturers when it comes to these parts.
Yeah, and I think there's two really important things that I want to point out that you mentioned there. One, the collaboration. You've said this several times, right, throughout these common questions that we get and what we see from manufacturers. Collaboration is key, right, in all of these areas. A manufacturer is going to best understand their device. They're going to best understand the risks, the essential performance, what it's supposed to do, the use cases, right? And working together to identify these things and then use that to put together a test plan is going to be the most successful way, right, to operate and work together. And then I think the second thing, which we've mentioned, as you said on this podcast before, is just this idea of ongoing compliance and that all of these things are living and breathing documents, right? It's not just you review it, it's static, it's done, this is complete, and now you move on to the next thing. You're constantly looking at these things throughout the process, as well as then, even within the full life cycle of a product, okay, how is it performing in the field? Taking that all the way back to the beginning, working that through your risk management process, your essential performance, and just this continuous cycle to keep improving and make sure you're keeping up the standards and technology and what you're finding out from your devices in the field and things like that. So I think it's really important to remember. I mean, we're seeing such amazing advances with medical technologies, and we're all in this same kind of boat together, right? Collaborating, working together, and continuing to make, healthcare more accessible and make these products more available. So lots of interesting questions. Really appreciate your time and coming on today. I'm sure we'll get more questions from people listening. So if you have questions, feel free to send them in to us and we will make sure to get those answered to you individually. Again, Jenny, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to have you on to chat with us today. And we'll talk to everybody soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Clarissa.